It was a town of green fields, cobblestone streets, and thick woods that whispered old stories. Eldergrove, nestled between quiet hills, had always felt like a town out of time. The sun painted the sky with soft hues of gold and amber, giving everything a warm, eternal glow. But more than that, Eldergrove was a place where people took pride in knowing one another, where neighbors were family, and the history was passed down like precious heirlooms. At the heart of this peaceful town stood the Bishopson estate, a sprawling Victorian manor on Hollow Street. Its dark stone walls, ivy, draped and towering, made it seem both a sanctuary and a castle. The garden was meticulously maintained, the hedges trimmed to perfection, and the roses that bloomed in vibrant shades of red and white were a testament to the care taken by the family who lived there. The Bishopsons, the town's most revered family, had lived in Eldergrove for generations. There was something almost ethereal about them. James Bishopson, the patriarch, was a tall, well-spoken man with graying hair and a penchant for wearing expensive suits even on casual days. His wife, Eleanor, was elegant and graceful, her soft, warm smile making everyone feel at ease. Their two children, Adam and Margaret, were well, behaved and respectful. They attended the best schools, helped out at the local orphanage, and were often seen walking hand in hand with their parents on Sundays, making their way to the old church at the end of the street. The town adored them. There was a sense of security in knowing that the Bishopsons lived at the edge of town. They had always been the foundation upon which Eldergrove rested. It was said that the town's good fortune, the flourishing crops, the prosperous businesses, the clear skies, was because of the Bishopsons. There were whispered tales of an ancient well in their backyard, a relic from a time when the land was new and untouched. It was said that the well held something special. The town's elders spoke little of it, but the superstition was clear. As long as the well remained full, so too would the town's prosperity. Eldergrove had seen its fair share of droughts, yet the well behind the Bishopson estate never ran dry. Its water was always crystal clear, even in the hottest months when every other well in town had dried up. People speculated about it, but none dared ask questions. After all, the Bishopsons were good people, and good people didn't make deals with forces beyond understanding. But that all changed one summer evening. Elias Crane had never meant to move to Eldergrove. It was supposed to be a short stay, just enough to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. He had rented a small cottage next door to the Bishopson estate, a place where the townsfolk seemed to be ever so eager to tell him about their beloved neighbors. He had heard the stories about the Bishopsons' generosity, their charity work, their secret to a happy life. But it wasn't until Elias had arrived that he began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Elias was a man of observation, always curious, always digging deeper than most would. It didn't take long before he noticed the subtle oddities surrounding the Bishopson estate. The way the birds would fall silent as the sun dipped below the horizon, the way the townsfolk would occasionally avert their gaze when speaking of the Bishopsons, and then there was the well. Elias had never seen a well like it. The stones around it were ancient, worn smooth by years of time. The water, despite the dryness that gripped the town, never faltered. It remained clear, shimmering like a pool of liquid silver. But on nights when the wind howled through the trees, Elias swore he heard something faint, a low, almost imperceptible hum, coming from the well. One evening, driven by an unfamiliar instinct, Elias decided to investigate. The Bishopson house, as grand and imposing as it was, appeared almost too perfect. Lights flickered softly in the windows, casting long shadows against the polished stone of the mansion. It was a Thursday night, and the town was quiet. Most of the people were gathered at the local pub, as they always were on Thursday nights, and the streets were empty. Elias walked around the back of the estate. his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. As he neared the well, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The air felt heavier here, as though it were thick with history, old buried history. He glanced around quickly. The Bishopsons were known for their love of privacy, so he had to be careful. He leaned closer to the well, peering into the darkness. Suddenly a shadow moved within. Elias froze, his heart thumping loudly in his chest. For a split second he thought he saw someone standing at the bottom of the well. The figure was tall, cloaked in what looked like a dark robe, and its face was obscured by shadows. Before he could even react, the figure seemed to vanish, as if it had never been there at all. Elias stepped back, breath shallow, his mind racing. He turned quickly, ready to leave, but something made him pause. A soft, whispering voice seemed to echo in his mind. It was faint, but clear enough for him to hear. "It is almost time. The town will know." He didn't know what it meant, but the words sent a shiver through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the Bishopson estate, and that it had something to do with that well. The next morning, Elias tried to go about his day as usual, but the images from the previous night haunted him. He knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen, but when he brought it up to the townsfolk, they only smiled and dismissed his concerns. The Bishopsons were beloved, after all. Why would anyone suspect them of anything sinister? Little did Elias know, his curiosity would lead him down a path that no one in Eldergrove could escape, and that well, it wasn't just any well. The days following Elias's strange encounter with the well were a blur of sleepless nights and unsettling dreams. He couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was waiting in the shadows of the Bishopson estate. Every time he walked past the towering stone gates or looked up at the grand house, the nagging sense of foreboding grew stronger. It was a Thursday when Elias decided to investigate further. He had spent the last few days gathering information, speaking to the townsfolk, and scouring the library for any history of the Bishopson family. But everything was just too perfect. The records were sparse, and no one seemed willing to entertain the idea of anything wrong with the Bishopsons. In fact, the town's reverence for them was almost unnatural. They were the lifeblood of Eldergrove. The idea of questioning their integrity or their legacy was almost sacrilegious. Still, Elias couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at him, the well, the shadow. The whisper. That afternoon, he decided to pay a visit to the town's only remaining historian, an elderly woman named Agnes Ward. She lived on the outskirts of Eldergrove in a small, run-down cottage, surrounded by stacks of old books, maps, and strange artifacts. Agnes had lived in Eldergrove longer than anyone, and Elias was certain she would know something about the Bishopsons, or, more specifically, their well. Elias knocked on her door and was greeted by a frail but sharp-eyed woman, her gray hair tied into a messy bun. "Ah, young man, Elias, isn't it?" Agnes's voice was raspy but kind. She gestured for him to come in. "What brings you to this corner of the world?" "I've been looking into the Bishopson family." Elias began, keeping his voice casual. "I'm trying to find out more about their history, particularly about the well behind their house." At the mention of the well, Agnes's eyes widened for a brief moment before she quickly masked her reaction. She motioned for him to sit as she shuffled to a dusty bookshelf and pulled out a thick leather-bound tome. "The Bishopsons, she said, her tone quieter now. "A fine family, good to the town, good to the people, but—" She paused, her fingers tracing the edges of the book, as though she were hesitant to open it. "There are things you may not know, things that don't get spoken about much anymore. People like to forget." She flipped the book open to a chapter titled The Covenant of Eldergrove. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still legible. Elias leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean by covenant?" Agnes hesitated again, then cleared her throat. "There was a pact long ago. When Eldergrove was first founded, the town was struggling. Droughts, famine, disease. It was the Bishopson ancestors, then known by a different name, who stepped forward to make a deal with the forces that dwelled beneath the land. They offered something precious in exchange for prosperity: water, food, health, wealth. Elias furrowed his brow. A deal with what? Agnes met his gaze. Her eyes darkened with a secret she could no longer keep. With something ancient, something that exists beneath the earth. The well was the gateway. Elias leaned back in his chair. That sounds like superstition. Perhaps. Agnes replied, but superstition has a way of becoming reality. The Bishopsons didn't just thrive, they flourished, and when the well remained full despite the worst of droughts, people began to believe the Bishopsons were more than just a wealthy family. They were blessed, and they were bound by this covenant. Elias felt his stomach tighten. He thought back to the well, the shadow he'd seen, the voice he'd heard. What happens when the well dries? He asked quietly. Agnes sighed deeply, her gaze drifting toward the window, as if she could see the well from here, despite the distance. When the well dries, the town begins to wither, the covenant is broken, and the price must be paid. It's why the well must never be emptied. The Bishopsons must ensure it stays full, no matter what. Elias sat in stunned silence. It was hard to believe what she was saying, but there was a strange weight to her words, as though she knew something far more sinister than she was willing to admit. And if the well is emptied, Elias pressed. Agnes's lips pressed together in a thin line. She opened her mouth to speak, but then stopped herself. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "You don't want to know." Before Elias could press further, the door creaked open, and a young woman walked into the room. She was tall, with striking auburn hair and sharp features. Her eyes were pale, almost ghostly. Agnes looked up, startled. "Margaret," she murmured, her voice tight with something unspoken. "What are you doing here?" Margaret Bishopson smiled faintly. "I came to check on the old woman. You know how she gets with her stories." Her gaze flicked to Elias. "And who is this?" Elias stood up, uneasy at the sudden tension in the room. "I'm just— Oh, we know who you are." Margaret interrupted smoothly, her smile never faltering. "You're the curious one, the one poking around where you shouldn't. People like you are never satisfied with the truth." Her tone was polite, but there was something unsettling in the way she spoke, as if she already knew exactly what Elias was thinking, as if she had already anticipated his every question. Margaret's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary before she turned to Agnes with a soft, almost patronizing chuckle. "I do hope you're not filling his head with nonsense, Agnes. The Bishopsons are beloved, and no one would dare question that." Elias's heart skipped a beat. There was something cold about her presence, something off in the way she spoke. Her words were too perfect, too rehearsed. Agnes didn't respond. Instead, she closed the book with a snap, and for the first time since Elias had entered the cottage, he saw a hint of fear in her eyes. Margaret turned toward the door. "Good day, Mr. Crane. I trust you'll leave town soon. It's best that you don't get too comfortable here." With that, she was gone. Elias stood still, his mind racing. There was something deeply unsettling about Margaret Bishopson, something beyond the polite exterior she had shown. As he walked out of Agnes's cottage, he couldn't help but feel as though he was being watched by eyes that were far older, far wiser, and far more dangerous than anyone in Eldergrove could comprehend. And as he walked back to his cottage, he swore he heard something faint, like the softest murmur on the wind, a voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The days after his conversation with Margaret Bishopson passed like a storm that had yet to fully break. Elias couldn't escape the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into something far darker than he had ever imagined. The town, once charming and quaint, now seemed to be suffocating under a weight that none of its residents could see, let alone understand. Every corner of Eldergrove seemed to whisper to him, the well, the town's secret, the Bishopsons' pact, and the more he learned, the more he realized how little he knew. Elias had spent countless hours in the library, scouring old records, diaries, and ledgers. Most of the information about the Bishopsons was vague generations of success, of prosperity, but there were gaps. The further back he went, the less there was to find. It was as though someone had deliberately erased key moments in the family's history, and the only trail that remained was a thread that led directly to the well. It was on the 5th night, after his meeting with Agnes, that Elias could no longer resist. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but there were still too many missing. He needed to know what lay beneath that cursed stone well, and for that he needed to get closer. That evening he returned to the Bishopson estate. The house loomed in the distance, its windows glowing with an unnatural steady light. The once inviting mansion now felt like a prison, its stone walls closing in on him with every step he took. Elias crept around the back of the estate once more. The well was silent, still, but there was something different about it tonight. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the shadows around it seemed to stretch further than they should. He couldn't explain it. There was an undeniable pull, like something was calling to him from the depths. Without hesitation, Elias knelt down beside the well. He had no tools, no plan. He had come here to find answers, and this, he realized, was the only way to get them. He gripped the edge of the stone with both hands, peering into the blackness below. The water, as always, was clear and still, but the air felt oppressive, like something was waiting, watching. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the water. At first it was subtle, just a slight ripple, but then the surface of the well began to twist, as if something below was stirring. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled backward, nearly losing his balance. His heart pounded in his chest. The water swirled violently, and before he could react, a faint figure appeared at the bottom of the well, a figure cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by shadows. It was the same figure he had seen the night he first approached the well. Suddenly, the figure's hand shot up, gripping the stone edge of the well. Elias froze, his entire body locked in fear. The figure's fingers were long, pale, and twisted, like they had been submerged in the earth for centuries. Its hand slowly pulled itself upward, dragging the rest of the body with it. For a moment, everything was still. The figure, its face still hidden, rose up from the depths. The well groaned as though the earth itself was protesting its intrusion, and then the figure's face came into view. It wasn't human. The creature's eyes were wide, too large for its face, gleaming with an unnatural, otherworldly light. Its skin was pale and stretched thin, clinging to bone. There was no mouth, no nose, just two hollow, black sockets where features should have been. Elias couldn't breathe. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but all he could do was stare at the thing, trapped in a nightmarish paralysis. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed inside his mind. You should have stayed away. The figure reached out a long, clawed hand, and in that moment, Elias's instincts took over. He ran. He didn't care where, just away from that thing, away from the well. His heart hammered in his chest as he sprinted back toward the town, not daring to look back. When Elias reached his cottage, he slammed the door shut and bolted the lock. He was shaking, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. He collapsed to the floor, his mind spinning with what he had just witnessed. What in the name of God was that thing, and why did it want him? The next day, Elias returned to Agnes's cottage. She had been his only ally in this strange, nightmarish journey, and he needed answers. He couldn't do this alone anymore. When he arrived, Agnes was sitting in her usual chair by the fire, staring into the flames. She didn't seem surprised to see him, nor did she ask any questions as he sat down across from her. It was as though she had been expecting this moment. You saw it, didn't you? She said softly, her voice tinged with regret. The creature in the well. Elias nodded, his throat tight with fear. What was it, and why is it in the well? Agnes sighed deeply, her old eyes clouded with memories she'd tried to bury. She opened the book she had shown him before, the one that detailed the history of the Bishopson family, and turned to a page Elias hadn't noticed earlier. This page was covered in strange symbols, some of which Elias recognized from his dreams, others that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. The creature you saw, it's not just a spirit, it's a sentient being, a force of the earth, a manifestation of the pact made by the Bishopsons long ago. Agnes's voice quivered, but she continued. When the well was first dug, it wasn't just a source of water, it was a portal, a conduit for something older, something that predates the town itself. The Bishopsons made a bargain with it, offering their blood and the blood of their descendants in exchange for prosperity, but there's always a cost. Elias felt a sickening realization in his gut. The well, it's never supposed to run dry. No, Agnes replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When the well runs dry, the pact is broken, and that thing, that creature, it comes out. It comes for the Bishopsons and for everyone in the town. Elias stood up suddenly, his pulse racing. What can we do to stop it? How do we fix this? Agnes looked up at him, her face grave. It's too late. Once the well begins to empty, the town is already cursed. There's no stopping it. The creature will awaken fully, and the price will be paid. The Bishopsons knew this day would come. They just hoped to delay it as long as possible. Elias staggered back, the weight of her words crushing him. And the town. The people. What will happen to them? Agnes's eyes were distant, lost in thought. The same thing that happened to the others who made the pact. The town will wither, the crops will die, the people will fall ill, and when the creature is done with them, she trailed off as if the words were too painful to finish. Elias's mind raced. The people of Eldergrove had no idea what was coming for them. They had no idea the well was drying, no idea that they were living on borrowed time. He had to warn them, but it was too late. The well had been emptied, and the creature was already awake. The sun rose the next morning over Eldergrove, but it wasn't the same sun that Elias had known. There was a coldness to the light, a heaviness in the air, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The once verdant fields were now barren, the trees bare, and the flowers that had once bloomed in vibrant colors were now wilted, their petals dry and lifeless. The entire town seemed to be on the edge of something terrible, something unstoppable. Elias couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that the end had already begun. He had seen the creature in the well, and now there was no turning back. The well was drying, and as Agnes had said, the pact was broken. The town's prosperity was over, and whatever had been sealed beneath that well was free to do what it had always done take. He had warned Agnes, but even she seemed resigned to the inevitable. The old woman's warnings had been nothing more than a slow unraveling of truth that now weighed down on him like a stone. There was no stopping what was coming, no saving the town. He had seen the shadow rise from the well, and now it was time for Eldergrove to pay its price. Elias knew he couldn't just sit idly by and wait for the town to fall to ruin. He had to act, even if it was too late. He had to find a way to stop it, to stop the creature, to stop the town from being devoured by whatever ancient horror the Bishopsons had invited into their home centuries ago. That afternoon Elias went back to the well. The atmosphere in Eldergrove was oppressive, every step he took feeling heavier than the last. He passed by the townsfolk, their faces drawn and weary, their eyes clouded with an anxiety that hadn't been there before. The elders, the shopkeepers, the families, everyone was on edge. They didn't know what was happening, not yet, but they could feel it. They could feel that something was wrong. When Elias reached the Bishopson estate, it was eerily quiet. The grand mansion loomed over him like a mausoleum, its windows dark and vacant, its door sealed tight. No light filtered through the cracks, no sign of life within. It was as though the Bishopsons had vanished entirely, leaving only their empty home behind. Elias stood there for a long moment staring at the house. He had to confront them, had to find answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the Bishopsons were likely gone, or worse, already part of the creature's dark designs. Whatever had been promised, whatever had been buried beneath that well, had consumed them as well. They were as much victims of the pact as the rest of the town, though they were the ones who had initiated it. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the back of the estate. The well stood there, as ominous and silent as ever, but now it was different. The air around it felt charged, as though something dark had risen from the depths, a force that could no longer be contained. He approached slowly, his feet heavy with dread. The water in the well was gone. It was just a hollow pit now, its stone walls lined with roots and dirt, but no sign of the ancient liquid that had once filled it. The stillness of the space around it was suffocating, and Elias could almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The creature was close, he could sense it. He knelt down beside the well, peering into the darkness below. The deep blackness seemed endless, a void that stretched down farther than the eye could see. The hum he had heard before was louder now, a deep resonance that seemed to reverberate through his bones. And then a sound, a whisper. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't his imagination. Elias could hear it, clear as day, coming from the depths of the well. "You shouldn't have come back." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard the night of the first encounter, the voice that had come from the figure in the well. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You will pay for your curiosity. You will pay for your trespass." He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him trembled, and the sky overhead darkened. The wind picked up, swirling violently, carrying with it a strange, foul odor, a sickening stench of decay and rot. The once peaceful, picturesque town of Eldergrove was now a place of nightmares, a town on the verge of collapsing into ruin. Elias's mind raced. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here and wait for the inevitable. There had to be a way to stop this, to stop the creature and whatever was coming for them. As he turned to leave, he saw something move in the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but no, it was too deliberate, too quick. A shadow darted across the edge of the well, something that moved faster than any human should have been able to. Elias's pulse quickened. He was not alone. Before he could react, the shadow lunged. It was the creature. The thing from the well. It had emerged fully formed now, its skeletal frame looming over him, its eyes, those horrible hollow eyes, locked onto his. The air around them crackled with dark energy. Elias barely had time to think before the creature's long, clawed hand reached for him, its fingers inches from his throat. But just before the creature could make contact, a flash of light, bright and blinding, exploded around them. Elias was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground, his vision blurred by the sudden onslaught of light. The creature recoiled, screeching in agony. The light intensified, forming into a shape, a figure that was neither human nor animal, but something ancient and powerful. It stood tall, its form radiant and golden, its eyes glowing with an intensity that made the creature shrink back in fear. Elias blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. A voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the air. "This town has paid its price. The creature will be sealed again, but the price will always be known." With a final, blood-curdling scream, the creature vanished, swallowed by the light. The air grew still once more, the oppressive weight lifting. Elias slowly stood up, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear. The figure before him began to dissipate, its light fading into the air like smoke, and then, in the distance, he heard the bells of Eldergrove's church toll. The price had been paid, but for how long? Eldergrove was never the same again. The once thriving town, so full of life and prosperity, had turned into a shadow of its former self. The fields that had once produced abundant harvests lay barren, the roads cracked and worn, and the once lush forests surrounding the town were now just twisted, dark silhouettes against the sky. The air, thick with the stench of decay, hung heavy over the town like a curse. Elias stood at the edge of Eldergrove, staring down at the crumbling streets. The church bells had ceased tolling, but their echo still lingered in his ears, a reminder of the price that had been paid. The creature, that ancient horror from beneath the well, had been banished for now, but the damage had been done. The pact had been broken, and Eldergrove was dying. Elias had tried to warn the townspeople. He had pleaded with them, begged them to leave, to escape before the curse took them all, but they had refused to listen. The Bishopsons had been their beacon of hope, their source of good fortune. And when the well had emptied, when the prosperity had vanished, the people had refused to accept the truth. They had clung to their faith in the Bishopsons, convinced that everything would return to normal. But they were wrong. The creature had been sealed away again, but its influence still lingered in the air like a dark cloud, and now the town was suffering the consequences of their ignorance. Elias couldn't stay in Eldergrove anymore. He had seen too much, witnessed too much horror. The light that had banished the creature had faded, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. He knew that Eldergrove was doomed. The curse would eventually return, stronger than before, and the town would be consumed. There was no escaping it, but even as he made the decision to leave, Elias couldn't help but wonder, had the creature truly been sealed away, or was it simply biding its time, waiting for the right moment to rise again? The Bishopson estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now an empty shell. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging off their hinges. The garden was overgrown, its roses withered, and the once grand stone well stood empty, its dark mouth staring back at him like a gaping wound in the earth. He had been to the well one last time after the creature's banishment. The air around it had felt different, lighter, as though the town's curse had lifted, at least for now, but as he stared into the depths, he could still feel its presence. It was as if the well was waiting for something, waiting for the day when the pact would be revived. Elias knew that nothing in Eldergrove could last forever. Not the Bishopsons, not the prosperity, and certainly not the well. There would always be another cycle, another generation to make the same mistakes. The creature would rise again, and when it did, the town would pay the price once more. Months passed, and Elias left Eldergrove behind, seeking refuge in a new town, far from the memories of the horrors he had witnessed. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. The well, the creature, the Bishopsons, it all followed him, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. He settled in a small village by the coast, where the air was fresh and the land untouched by the darkness of Eldergrove. But even here, the shadow of what he had seen lingered. At night, when the wind howled through the trees, he would wake in a cold sweat, his mind flashing back to the well, to the creature's hollow eyes, to the voice that had whispered in his ear. It wasn't long before Elias heard rumors. Whispers of a new family, a young couple with 2 children, who had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of the village. They had come from Eldergrove. Elias's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. The cycle was beginning again. Years passed, and Elias grew older. The weight of his past never left him, but he learned to live with it, to bury it deep within. He married, had children of his own, and built a life far from the horrors of Eldergrove. But even in the quiet of his new home, he could never escape the memory of the well, of the creature, and of the town that had once been so full of life, until the well behind the Bishopson estate had been emptied. One fateful day, as Elias sat on his porch, watching the sunset over the rolling hills, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. A man, tall and thin, with a face that seemed strangely familiar. It was then that Elias understood. The man came closer, and Elias saw it was him, Elias Crane, his younger self, standing there as if he had never left Eldergrove. "You were right, you know," the younger Elias said, his voice tinged with a strange sadness. "It never ends. The well always calls, and the cycle always starts again." Elias stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he whispered, "it's over. It has to be." but the younger Elias just shook his head. The well never truly empties, not for long. As Elias watched, his younger self turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight, leaving nothing but the soft whisper of the wind behind. And in the distance, somewhere far off, he could hear the faintest sound, a low, hollow hum, rising from the earth. The well had emptied again.